On August 23rd, 2017, two new vehicles for the Last Jedi movie were officially revealed on StarWars.com. However, these two vehicles highlight in what is, in my opinion, a recent trend at Disney, where it seems that things are not designed in a practical way, but in a way to harken back to the nostalgia of the original films, without considerations of physics and military doctrine. Let me explain, though, before I get into flame war. I understand that Star Wars is fictional, specifically science fantasy, not hard science fiction. But that being said, they should still be designed with practicality in mind, even if it's practicality for that universe. Now let's start with the AT-M6, or the all-terrain Mega Caliber 6, whatever a Mega Caliber is, the so-called Guerrilla Walker. Now, I'm personally not a fan of large walkers in general, because of their limited field of fire, low speed, and large size. However, I'm willing to give the AT-AT a pass for being the first of its kind, something that was, for the first time, truly unique and foreign compared to other sci-fi vehicles. The AT-M6, on the other hand, doesn't innovate in the same way that you see from the AT-TE to the AT-M6. In fact, the AT-TE, in my opinion, has some elements that make it superior to the AT-M6, such as the main mass driver cannon, which has a wide field of fire, and the ability to precisely target objects such as an anti-tank rocket. It also has the ability to scale cliffs, operate in the vacuum of space, and serves as transport in the Grand Army of the Republic. The AT-M6 thus ends up being a regressive design compared to its 50-year-old grandpa. I mean, think of the revolutions in tank design that occurred looking from, say, the Sherman tank to the Abrams, or from the Little Willie to the Chieftain or Centurion. I mean, honestly, that's a huge amount of development, and even if we assume that our technological development was an anomaly and should have been much slower, the difference between even 30 years is enormous. Hence, the sense for a walker that fills the role of a tank doesn't make much sense. Conventional design places emphasis on mobility, which includes the ability to shoot accurately on the move, having a low profile, and versatility. This is why most countries have a main battle tank, examples being the Leopard 2, M1 Abrams, and T-72 lines of tanks. All of these tanks, while developed by different nations with different purposes, all attempt to achieve this goal in their own way, and all share common design traits, such as a rotating turret, high speed, and maneuverability, and all are currently in service in some form despite having been developed during the Cold War. But the AT-M6 has none of these things in its favor, and in fact seem to regress in these areas. Furthermore, according to the Star Wars lore, the AT-AT was more so designed for intimidation and using its high vantage point to support the infantry it carried, and less as a main battle tank in the conventional sense. However, we don't know if these are transports yet, and given the First Order is not enforcing its law yet on unwilling systems as far as we know, why design these to be intimidating if it's impractical? Now, I've heard some say the AT-M6 could be an artillery vehicle with the capacity to serve on the front line, but I still don't see how this design complements that role. I mean, take this, or this, or to modern self-propelled guns such as the Paladin and M109 series, Gvozdika, Akatsuka, Caesar, M110, M107, Malka, Ondava, and those are just the ones using guns. I'm not even looking at the numerous multiple launch rocket systems that have been developed. I'm particularly confused when contrasted to modern artillery, given that some of these can fire in a direct fire role if it was in combat. Not as accurately as a tank per se, but capable nonetheless. And it does this while being more maneuverable and likely more cost-effective than its walker comparison. I mean, even in Star Wars lore, the AT-AP and AT-TE could still be used to provide indirect fire. So why not use them, like this being cheaper and more versatile? Now, considering that the actual Mega Caliber 6 gun is mounted above the neck in a stationary stance to the hull, if you could call it that, let's look at some real-life history and examples to show why this is still ineffective. The grandparents of all these are the German anti-tank vehicles in the form of the Stug 3, Stug 4, Hetzer, and the Jagdpanther, maybe even the Marder 3. All of these had a long barrel that were mounted in the hull of the vehicle, or in the case of the Marder, kind of jury-rigged on top of the hull. Thus, the hull itself was low profile, making it harder for an enemy crew to spot and kill. Finally, the Stug line in particular was produced in a relatively large number, the Marder line being modified from captured tanks, and were quite effective, so effective that, such as the Stug 3, were used by Finland as their main combat vehicle until the early 60s, and the design inspired the Swedish S-tank, which saw service until the late 90s. These designs do have their advantages and reasons for existing, but the gun on the AT-M6 seems to be mounted so impractically, so that it could only attack other walkers, requiring the tank to kneel down in order to hit its target. So while not as flashy as some heavy walker, all of the tanks or assault guns I mentioned in the modern era, in our own history, were designed to counter the enemy doctrine. The S-tank, for example, was designed to dig itself in for defense, and had an autoloader so it could engage large amounts of Soviet armor. But this leads me to a question. Why develop a slow armored walker against an enemy that primarily uses infantry and air power? When something like a flame tank or the Russian BMP-T was geared towards fighting infantry in tight environments make more sense. I mean, seriously, look at the BMP-T. 2 autocannons, ATGMs, or AA missiles, and grenade launchers. Doesn't that sound like something that makes more sense for dealing with an enemy that primarily uses infantry and light vehicles? Probably because Russia developed it after learning their lesson from prior conflicts against insurgent groups that used light vehicles and infantry, with some other heavier vehicles sprinkled in, I guess you could say, for flavor. If it's not clear, I don't see why the First Order would use the AT-M6. It seems to fail in every category that tanks needs to be successful, and literally retreads old ground without iterating more than adding a big gun. And to top it all off, the article makes note that they were designed it so that tow cables wouldn't work against it. But this doesn't make much sense. Yeah, you might not be able to trip it like before, which is okay, but the ATTE didn't have to worry about that either, so hooray, I guess. And I would wager that it could still be indeed taken out by a tow cable. You know, a larger vehicle, such as a GR-77, with more power, to a thicker tow cable, and hit it from the side and pull it down. The walker won't be able to just get up and just be a sitting duck. Also, how would one recover this vehicle if such a thing did happen? Modern armies have recovery and engineering vehicles to solve for this, which are usually just modified tankles. But how do you recover an AT-M6? Or is it just going to sit there till it's buried or entirely scrapped by all of the locals? This just may seem like a small point, but for a small force in the unknown regions, I would wager that conserving resources and making do with what you have, reusing and repairing also what you've already built, are all extremely important. So it just doesn't make much sense why you'd want something that just seems larger and more impractical than, you know, its grandpa and its father. It just doesn't seem to make sense to me. But what about the Mandator IV, you ask? Well, wondering how much more enraged I could get over my Star Wars. Well, it could be even worse. In other words, no matter how you view it, this is at best a steaming pile of hot garbage. Now, at first glance, it looks like a Star Destroyer until you fully process it. Starting with the obvious, the surface itself presents numerous problems. 1. The AA guns can now easily destroy each other because they are mounted on a flat plane, meaning that not all the vehicle's weapons can concentrate fire. Heck, the guns are even the same height. 2. Severely limited field of fire. This ties into the first problem, meaning that this is a really inefficient way to mount the weapons, wasting energy and weaponry that can be used on other systems. This exacerbates the issue that the First Order was supposed to be a fringe group that has many resources, meaning it needs everything to function at peak efficiency to make up the difference. 3. Requires a larger bridge by limiting the amount of room for subdecks to provide space for the crew, ammunition, and secondary systems. 4. Limits the additional weapon systems that can be added, such as torpedoes, concussion missiles, and mid-range weaponry because of this lack of space. The worst part is that for claiming to take inspiration from battleships of our universe, they failed to recognize the reason for their design, such as the staggering of weapons was to have better fields of fire. The guns being on the center line of the ship and at various elevations made it possible to have at least 6 of its 12 main guns if it had 3 per turret, along with its numerous secondary weapons, all on target. If a battleship did use a flat surface, its guns wouldn't even have a more limited field of fire. And a more interesting direction for the Mandator is actually revealed not in the Yamato, which the artist says they took inspiration from to design the guns, but the Iowa-class battleships, in my opinion, because they were upgraded in the 80s under the Reagan administration with Seawees, close-in weapon systems, Harpoons, anti-ship missiles, Tomahawk, land attack missiles, and Stinger firing positions. Something like this would make more sense for the First Order, with limited resources to employ by modernizing, say, Imperial Star Destroyers or even some old Venators like this to fill this old doctrine. This makes more sense than designing a new warship, a Dreadnought class no less, to fulfill an entirely experimental doctrine. Then there's the weapon placement for the main gun. Let's ask ourselves, why put the main armament on the bottom? If you were using it to hit planets, it would make some sense, but this is space, you can just rotate it. It also limits its entire field of fire, maybe even requiring extra armor depending on if the heat of the projectile could cause issues for the underside. We should also ask the question, why mount these weapons far apart? The only reason I can think of is to allow for a faster follow-up shot, but those won't be as accurate because of the recoil. Heck, even the Malevolence from Star Wars The Clone Wars is a more practical design by having one cannon on either side of the ship, similar to how some ships mount their anti-ship missiles. The Malevolence is made to broadside. The Charon and Paris classes frigates in Halo were built to be used en masse in a firing line with their max. In other words, their weapons were placed according to how they were to be used in battle in the country's doctrine. And while this may seem like a trivial thing, let's consider for a moment what happens when firing a projectile in space. Newton's third law states that for every force, there is an equal and opposite force. No, not that force, that this is a Star Wars video. Now imagine the recoil from that gun firing. It's going to exert a lot of force in an uneven way across the ship. If fired at the same time, you're exerting a lot of force to propel the projectile forward, the opposite effect of which is pushing the ship backwards, which raises the question, why not just mount one cannon along the center line of the ship? Or a series of heavy turbo lasers raised along a superstructure like before. Heck, the Precursor, in my opinion, is a well-designed capital ship for this reason. The guns are placed in a way that makes sense, being able to fire in almost any direction, allowing it to engage and focus its fire however necessary in the battle, allowing itself to engage head-on or on a broadside, which means if it finds itself out of position, it will almost always have its other three guns to engage the enemy with. But I digress. Mounting it along the center line of the ship would also better distribute the recoil across the ship instead of having hang off the ship or the bottom of the ship. And we don't see any thrusters facing upward or to the side to adjust for the recoil of the gun. If they don't fire it right, you would need some thrusters to realign itself and get it back on target. And then there's the bridge. Now, Imperial ships have always had this issue, but others, such as the Resurgent, made by the same faction, worked to correct this. Well, they went in the opposite direction with this one, and given the size, it would be easy to eliminate the gun system by just destroying said bridge, rendering the ship basically useless without its officers, navigators, and so on. This undermines the lore of the First Order, in that they modernized the Imperial Navy, so this bridge is regressive in design, not a progression. Seeing a trend? And that is not to say I hate the concept of the Mandator IV. I love the Halo Mac cannon system, and having them mounted in this way, as they are, makes sense within the lore of that universe. Star Wars using a similar system is interesting, certainly more so than another Death Star. And it could be an interesting weapon system, but the design flaws need to be addressed. But why was this designed this way? If there are so many problems, then why would they design it in this sort of way? And I actually don't think it's the artist's thought that they were the ones designing it. The article from StarWars.com actually indicates the decision to have it flat and have AA guns wasn't their own, but mandated in the script. Thus, the artist had to design in accordance with the script, which makes sense, but it seems like there wasn't a lot of talk about how or why this was developed, which only plays in concerns that this will be Empire Strikes Back 2, because both would then introduce large walkers and a dreadnought, and perhaps in order to play fan service as they did in Force Awakens. But this brings us back to what I said at the beginning of the video. I've said vehicle so much. Empire did it first. It set the stage and was done to make a point. That while the Rebels had succeeded in destroying the Death Star, the Empire was far from gone and possessed other more conventional means of victory. Here it may serve the same purpose, but instead of seeing how warfare evolved between the Galactic Civil War and The Force Awakens, we just see more of the same, and it likely being used for the same purpose. Basically, I wish that instead of designing something mimicking The Empire Strikes Back, they would design something different to show the divergence in the Empire and the First Order, something that, in my opinion, needs desperately to be done. I mean, even between World War One and Two, there were a bit over 20 years apart, and we saw a divergence in military theory. The idea of combined arms and mobile warfare, which were budding at the end of the First World War, came into full fruition by the beginning of the Second. Which raises the question, how did warfare evolve in that time? Maybe the First Order learned that heavy vehicles such as the AT-AT didn't make sense for their strategic situation, and thus adopted a lighter, more mobile approach to counter an infantry threat, developing more IFVs and main battle tanks in an effort more similar to modern day. Heck, that strategy would make even more sense to capitalize on the decapitation of the New Republic leadership, and would see a rapid change in the balance of power, allowing them to capture more plants and systems faster, needing more industry, resources, and manpower to thrust into your war effort. All of this is to say that not enough thought was placed into the world building. They decided to play it safe, not providing a distinct look and feel for this new trilogy, which is something that this new series has struggled with, but even the prequels did well, and gave us a number of iconic designs. The LAAT, the AAT, ATDE, ATRT, HMP, Vulture Droid, and ARC-170, and so on. All these vehicles are unique and interesting in their own way. In my opinion, some are better than the originals. Then, when we see the next generation of vehicles in the original trilogy, it's even more interesting when we see where those designs came from, and the lore filled in why they changed. Thus, I'm willing to suspend my disbelief. But then we have these new vehicles, with no reason why they should exist in the world they are a part in. Thus, they take something that was interesting and original, and add some new paint and a bigger gun, and they call it a day. Because that's how things work. However, I can see how this line of thinking developed. In the article, the artists discussed how the tank evolved, specifically the Sherman to the Abrams, but in doing so they must have missed the point entirely. Both tanks are from different lines. It's not comparing apples to apples, it's comparing an apple to a 70-year-old orange. Going from the AT-AT to the AT-M6 is going, in this comparison, from the Sherman to, say, the Israeli Super Sherman. It's an upgrade or an iteration, not 20 years of development and evolution in between. In fact, in the years between the Sherman and the Abrams, there were numerous tank lines, notably the Patton line, which many countries have modified and use to this day. The Patton line was a long line of tanks, I believe the longest in American history, which many countries still use. The M46, M47, M48, M60, and M60 Starship, just to name a few. And this, because this doesn't address the variation in each of these tanks, going from A1 to A2 to A3 and so on, or how foreign countries upgraded these, or even how the military doctrine changed between the Sherman and the Abrams, one being deployed in formation, the other being used in a more fire and maneuver sort of way. None of these were considered all of these were considered in a way that the AT-TE and AT-M6 weren't. Now, this video has gone on long enough, but I hope that this is appeal to someone out there who demonstrates the number of issues with these designs. But I don't want to leave on such a sad note, just ripping on everything. So instead of complaining and ranting about the problem I see, I would like to offer some practical solutions, even if no one from Disney will probably see this and it's too late to be implemented. First, instead of having the AT-M6 be designed for combat, maybe it's designed as a command vehicle, and a cross between the AT-TE and AT-AT. Given its larger carrying capacity, it can boast boring but necessary things like long-range communications equipment, with other variants being used for supply, and while walkers aren't my favorite design, there is a place, say as a logistics vehicle, and while not as glamorous or as thrilling as a tank, their ability to basically go anywhere makes them useful in such a role. In fact, the Empire modified AT-TEs for the same purpose and reason, and it's necessary for any army to have a supply vehicle. But that's not like Empire, and it's not a tank, so they won't do that. As for the Mandator, as I stated earlier, I think it would be more interesting not as a new ship, but as a modification for some of the aging ships. The First Order Navy being designed in such a way to maybe counter the shielding of a Mon Calamari cruiser, and maybe a multi-role focus compared to the New Republic, or by changing Imperial naval doctrine. Maybe being similar to the pocket battleships of the Kriegsmarine, being used in a raiding role, not a direct combat one, because, hey, maybe they couldn't stand up to the full might of the New Republic Navy. All these things make world-building sense. It's things that happens in history, but it seems like they've neglected that, just focusing on what's cool and what will look good on the silver screen. I mean, these are just some ideas. Maybe I'll do more vehicle reviews in the future or other critiques of the Star Wars universe. If you liked or disliked this video, please click this corresponding button. I'm open to criticism. And if you like this format, then please let me know in the comments along with your thoughts on these vehicles. I may follow up on this after The Last Jedi, analyzing how they were used and all that, but for now, I bid farewell. Thank you for listening to this rant in a galaxy that's not so far away.